In this video, I'll be walking you through the basics of working with tables in Document. We'll create two different types of tables. We'll create a static table like we have over here, and we'll create a dynamic table like we have over here, all while showing you the best practices, tips, and tricks that'll help speed up your table development process. My name is Josh, I'm the founder of Documint, and without further ado, let's get started. So I've gone ahead and created a blank template here. So we'll start from scratch and we'll be using this document. This is what we'll be creating as our reference. It's supposed to be an invoice. Obviously it's missing a lot of data, but it's got the important bits for this lesson. So we've got our static table up here, as I mentioned. So let's start by creating this. We will start by adding a 2-column section at the top here. And we'll start off with an easy part, adding our logo on the left side. Not really related to tables, but it'll make our document look a little bit better. Okay, so now that we've got that in there, we can come down here and we can start building out our static table up here. So to make it a bit easier so we can see what we're doing and the different layers that we're adding, I'm going to turn on the layers panel so that we can see the different layers of our template. Up here we have our header section, and on the left is where we have our logo, and on the right is where we're going to be creating our customer information table. So looking at our reference document, we can see that our static table has 5 rows, and the first row has 1 column, that's our table header, and the data rows are 2 columns. So let's start by adding our header row. So we'll add a row into this. Over here, we're going to call this customer information table. Okay, we've got our row. This is going to be our header row. We can just add a text element directly in there. Okay, so we'll add our label or our header. And we'll start styling it later. We want to get the basic structure of the table down and working first, and then we'll come back and we'll start styling it later. So now we've got our header row. So we'll call this header row. Great. And now we'll start adding our data rows. So we'll come over here and we'll drop this under the row. And we can see that we're going under the row because the entire customer information table is highlighted. Okay, so we have our header row and now we have our first data row. In this data row, we're going to add 2 columns, just like that. And in each of those columns, we're going to add a text element. Perfect. So now you can see the basic structure of our table. We have our header row with just 1 column, and we have our first data row, and this has 2 columns. Now let's add the remaining data rows. So we have the next 3 rows that we need to create. So we'll go ahead and do that. We're going to do a little shortcut here, and we're going to select the first data row, and we're just going to clone that 3 times. So now we have our 4 data rows and our table header. Great. Now you're probably wondering, why do we have to have all of these row elements with separate column elements inside and then the text elements? Couldn't we just have a row with 2 columns and the right number of text elements inside, and those act as our rows? Well, the problem is that text elements will grow and shrink depending on the content that's inside of them. So for example, if we were to add some content to these, like name and the name variable and address and the address variable, then we were to add a border around each of these elements to make it a little bit more clear. So right now, everything looks good. Everything's aligned. There's no issues. Well, the problem comes in with these variable elements. They will grow or shrink based on the content that's inside of them. What do I mean by that? Well, if we switch over to the test tab, I've added some gibberish into the address field and left the name field blank, and you can see what that does. That address field has grown vertically in size, and the name field has shrunk down because the name is empty and the address is larger than 1 line. So if we were to bring this down to 1 line and add a name in here, click preview, it all looks good, and it won't be until you get some content that you're not expecting to throw this alignment off. So how do we fix that? We fix it by putting everything into its own individual row, and that keeps everything vertically aligned. So if we were to remove these extra elements and we place these into their own row, now I'm kind of messing up our table here, but we'll fix it, don't worry. Still looks good, but let's add some more gibberish over here, and let's get rid of this name like we did before. Click preview. And there you go. So everything is aligned. I know that the sizes are different, but this is why we don't put borders on text elements. We put them on the columns inside or the rows, and we'll cover that in a little bit. But everything stays aligned. Address doesn't start until down here. Okay, let's undo a lot of these changes that we've added so that we can get back to where we want to be. Okay, if we look back at our reference document, we have the 4 rows, our name, address, phone, and email. So we'll add that. And then we'll add some variables over here. These can be, depending on your project, they'll be different, but I'm going to group them all under the customer object by saying customer.name. So if we look at our data pane, we can see that we have this customer. Everything, name, address, phone, and email are all grouped under customer. Keeps it a little bit more organized. Depending on your project, you may or may not do it this way. We have another video talking about data structures and variables, so be sure to check that out for more information on that. Now let's switch over to our test tab and to have a look at our table. So we'll say John Doe, copy this address, copy the phone number, and add an email. Okay, so now if we click preview document, we'll see that our data got added to the table, and that's looking pretty close to what we have over here. We have a label on the left side. That's our row label, or a row header rather, and then our value on the right side. This is a static table. So we can switch back over to design and start styling our table. So I've selected each of these by holding shift and clicking on each one, and we're going to change the alignment to the right. The header cell, we're going to change it to the center, and let's start adding some colors, borders, and all of that. Switching over to our reference document, we're going to just grab the color of the header using a color picker. Okay, that's been copied to my clipboard. So now I can come over here, and actually I want to not select the text element. I'd rather select the entire row and apply it to the row. So we've selected the row. I'm going to come to background color and paste that in. You could also use the color picker over here, but I wanted to copy that exact color and I pasted it in here. Okay, now the text is going to be white. There we go. And we'll scale up the size of the text. Ooh. And that should be it for the header row. Now let's turn off the guides here. Have a look at what that looks like. All right, starting to come together. Next, we will style each of these rows, add some borders. So we'll select each of these rows just like that, holding shift like I was doing before. Actually, we don't want to select the last row. That's going to be a different color. That's going to be around the entire thing. So we'll come over here, we'll add a bottom border, and we'll select a light gray, just like we have in our reference document. All right, so that should be good. If we deselect that again, we can see we've got a light gray bottom border right in there. Now for the vertical grid lines, we're going to go into each of these and select the column, the first column. Okay, so now we're going to add it to the right of the column, and we're going to apply the same colors we did before, just like that. All right, so now if we have a look at it, we've got our vertical and horizontal grid lines in the table. Great. Now we need to just switch on over here and add a border around the entire element. So how we're going to do that, we're going to go over to the column. That's the group for this entire table, and we're just going to apply it to that. So we're going to say all sides and then paste the color that we have on our clipboard from before, paste it right in there, and that should do it. Let's have a look. We now have our static table. Switch over to the test, have a look at this. All right, very nice. Switch back over here. If we want to add a border radius around the whole thing, we can do that by selecting the column and then adding a border radius, just like that. Adds a little bit more style to it. Fantastic. Last thing I want to show you here is how to vertically align this label in the middle of this content over here, in the middle of this row. So we'll switch back over to our table and we will select this column, and then we will change the vertical alignment to middle, just like that. It doesn't look like anything in the template designer, but when we switch over to our template tester, you'll see that that is now vertically aligned. And you can do that for all of these if you want the labels all the way, always to be vertically aligned with the row. So that's about it. We've created our static table. We've added our header row. We've added our data rows. We've added some style, and there we go. All right, now we're going to switch over to our dynamic table. So what makes this dynamic? Well, this is dynamic because this data row is going to repeat for all of the line items that we have in our invoice. Now, this is just one example, but if you have a table that's going to grow or shrink depending on the number of items that you want to display, then it's going to be dynamic. And we're going to be using looping to create these data rows. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 columns, and the rows, we'll come back to that, but let's just create our 4 columns. So we have this 4 column element down here. Great. So the name column is the widest. It's about half of the table, and then the other 3 to share the other half. So how do we do that? Well, in Documint, columns are part of a 24 column grid system. What does that mean? That means that each one of these columns, its width is out of 24. So if we look at this over here, we'll go up to width and we see that it's 6. Each of these are the same width, and therefore each of these are 6, adding up to 24. 4 times 6 is 24. Now if we were to resize it, this would grow by 1 and this would shrink by 1. So this is now 7 and this is now 5. So 5 plus 7, 12, that takes up half. Okay, so we want this to be half the width, and the other columns are going to be 1/3. So that's going to be 4 for that, 4, and then that will be 4. All right, now we can add our text element to these columns. And we've just created our header row. What we'll do is we'll add a little bit of spacing so it separates itself from the top row. Okay, so this is going to act as our header row for our line items table, which is down here. So we'll go ahead and add some labels. Now, what we can do is we can save ourselves a little bit of time, select that entire row, clone it, and this is going to act as our data row. So let's just rename these. If we wanted, we could even group them inside of their own element to organize this a little bit better. So we could add a single column down here and then move each of these into that column. There we go. So now these are going to be our line items, and this is going to be our header, and these are going to be our data rows. Moving on, let's now convert our data row from a header row to a data row. How do we do that? We replace the header labels with the actual variables. So this is going to be name. If we switch back over to our variables, you can see that these are all added to the root, right? Name, price, quantity, and I had a typo here. Okay, and amount are all part of the root level of the variable schema. So depending on your use case, if you're connecting to a data source like Airtable, these are going to match the name of your fields. In this case, we're just creating our own. So we can name them whatever we want, just like we're going to name the actual list that they're going to go into. So what do I mean by that? We're going to repeat this row for each item in the line items list. So come up here to edit logic, switch over to repeat loop, and we're just going to call this line items. Okay, so what we've just done there is we've told Documint to repeat this data row for each item in line items. If we switch back over to our data tab, you can now see that everything is grouped under line items. And it looks just like customer, but it's actually different. This is a list and this is an object, meaning this is a direct property of this customer object. See, customer.name, whereas line items are going to be a list or an array of objects. So it's going to have a list of objects like this customer, and those are going to be our items. And each item is going to have a property on it called name, price, quantity, and amount. So if we switch over to our test tab, we can see what this looks like now. Over here, we have this line items section, and it's allowing us to add an item. So we'll click on plus to add our first item. So this will be item 1, 10, 1, and 10. So if we preview that now, we'll see that first item is now being displayed. If we add another item, the same thing will happen. Preview document. So this is what makes our dynamic table dynamic, is the fact that we're using the looping logic to loop over each of the items in line items. All right, now that we got the functionality of our table working the way that we want, let's start styling it and making it look like our reference document over here. So in our reference document, we see that we have a blue header, just like we do for the customer information. And then each of the rows are separated by a horizontal line, and we don't have the vertical grid line. We also have some formatting here, which we'll get to, and all of the number values are aligned to the right. So let's start doing that. We'll start by aligning all of these to the right by holding shift and selecting each one and then clicking align right. Now let's add a background color to our header row. This is text, so we're not there yet. So we'll just select this document remembered, the color that we used for the header up here. Click OK. And now we're going to set the text color to white. Now let's add our horizontal lines. It's a little bit different than we did with the static table, where we are not looping over the row, so we didn't have to worry about this. But when you do loop over a row element, what'll happen is the border that you add gets added to the entire group. What do I mean by that? So if we click border here, now this has just been added around the entire row element. And if we switch over to test, you'll see that it's actually wrapping both items. So how do we add a border in between them? Well, to do that, we're going to add it to the columns on the inside. So we're going to select each of these columns, and we're going to add a bottom border just like that. I'm going to change the color, make it this light gray. Okay. And we can see if we switch back over to our test tab, now we have a vertical, or a horizontal rather, line separating each of our lines. If we were to add one more, this would continue. And there we go. Okay, let's remove that border around the entire row. And we're just about there. If we switch back over to our test, that looks pretty good. All right, so finally, we're going to format these numbers so that the price and amount are currencies, and the quantity will have a separator, a thousands separator, in the case that we have that quantities over 1,000. For example, right now, if we had 3,000, we wouldn't have any formatting. That's just going to be 3,000. But if we want to have a comma after the 3, we'll want to format that. So how do we do that? We just add our number formatter. And this is not going to be a video on formatting. We have other videos for that, so be sure to check those out if you want more information. I'm just going to show you real quick how to format these. So we've added the $sign number to use the number formatter. We've kept the variable in the middle, and at the end, we add our format pattern. So this is going to be $0, comma 0. That means separate the thousands with the comma, dot, and then 0, 0. That's going to display the decimal places up to 2 decimal precision at the end. Let's have a look. Oops, looks like I forgot my closing quote. And there we have it. Now we've created our dynamic table. We're formatting the numbers, and everything's aligned properly. We've added a header and a data row that repeats. That's what that makes that dynamic. So in this video, we've shown you how to create a static table, how to create a dynamic table, how to edit multiple items at the same time, best practices for keeping vertical alignment between cells, and how to use the layers panel to navigate your layers a bit more easily. I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, be sure to either leave it in the comments if you're watching this on YouTube, reach out to us in the community, or reach out to our support. We look forward to hearing from you, and happy documenting.